The morning of August 17, 1943, broke cold over the Schweinfurt-Regensburg corridor. At 0730 hours, the air above East Anglia trembled with the roar of Wright's Cyclone engines as B-17 flying fortresses lifted into the pale English sky, one after another, their aluminum skins catching the early light like scales on some great mechanical fish. Inside the lead aircraft of the 303rd Bombardment Group, Major John L. Gerstad sat in the left-hand seat, his gloved hand steady on the yoke, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Germany waited. The air smelled of aviation fuel and gun oil, that particular perfume of American air power that had become familiar to every man who climbed into those bombers. In the waist gun positions, young men from Iowa and Texas and Pennsylvania checked their weapons one final time, their breath visible in the unheated fuselage, their hearts beating against their flight suits like fists against a door they were about to kick open. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. They were going to Schweinfurt. They were going to destroy the ball-bearing factories that kept the German war machine rolling. And they were going in broad daylight, at altitude, following the doctrine that had been drilled into every bombardier and pilot since the earliest days of the American bombing campaign: high-altitude precision bombing, staying above the flak, maintaining formation, letting the Norden bomb site do its geometric magic from 25,000 feet, where men became gods looking down on a world reduced to map coordinates and target folders. But there was another man in another cockpit that morning, and he carried with him a different vision entirely. Captain John Jack Matthes had been arguing with his superiors for months. Not openly, not in the way that would earn a court-martial or a transfer to some godforsaken training base in Arizona, but persistently, carefully, with the kind of quiet intensity that comes from absolute conviction. He had studied the reconnaissance photographs until his eyes burned. He had interviewed returning crews, pressed them for details about flak patterns and fighter attacks, and the frustrating imprecision of bombing from altitudes where atmospheric winds could push a bomb hundreds of yards off target. He had read intelligence reports about German flak batteries, about their effective ceilings and their blind spots, and he had arrived at a conclusion that made his fellow pilots shake their heads and his commanding officers narrow their eyes in concern. They were flying too high. The theory was beautiful in its simplicity, taught in every American air warfare manual, preached by the prophets of air power like Billy Mitchell and Hap Arnold. Altitude meant safety. Altitude meant you could see the target, clearly could position your formation precisely, could give the bombardier time to make his calculations without the rushed panic of low-level attack. Altitude meant you stayed above the worst of the flak, those black flowers of explosive death that bloomed at 15,000 feet and below with murderous efficiency. The Germans had built their defenses around this understanding. They knew the Americans would come high, and so they positioned their guns accordingly, creating a ceiling of steel and shrapnel that any bomber would have to penetrate to reach its target. But what if you didn't go through the ceiling? What if you went under it? Matthes had proposed it in briefings, sketched it on blackboards, run the numbers again and again. A low-altitude approach, coming in at 2,000 feet or even lower, beneath the minimum effective range of the heavy flak guns, too fast and too low for accurate tracking, sacrificing the precision of high-altitude bombing for the shock of sudden appearance and the overwhelming advantage of being where the enemy had not prepared to meet you. His fellow pilots had listened with the polite skepticism reserved for madmen and poets. Going in low meant you were in range of everything: light flak, machine guns, small arms fire from the ground. It meant there was no time to recover from damage, no altitude to trade for speed if an engine was hit. It meant flying through your own bomb blasts if your timing was off by even seconds. It meant essentially offering yourself to the enemy at point-blank range and hoping your speed and surprise would carry you through before they could react. They called it suicide. They called it impractical. They called it a maverick fantasy cooked up by a pilot who had watched too many fighter jocks and forgotten that bombers were not nimble P-38s that could dance and dodge. The doctrine was clear, and doctrine existed for a reason, forged in the experience of countless missions and the hard lessons of men who had died, learning what worked and what didn't. But doctrine, Matthes argued quietly, could also be a prison. Doctrine assumed the enemy was static, that they wouldn't adapt, wouldn't learn, wouldn't build their defenses precisely to counter your preferred method of attack. And by August of 1943, the Germans had learned the American doctrine very well indeed. They knew the altitudes. They knew the approach patterns. They knew where to mass their guns to create killing zones through which the American bombers would have to fly. Maintaining their tight formations, unable to maneuver, predictable as clockwork. The losses had been mounting. Schweinfurt would prove that with brutal clarity, though none of them knew it yet on that August morning. The price of high-altitude daylight precision bombing was being calculated in burning fortresses and parachutes, blossoming like funeral flowers over German soil. For every factory damaged, for every strategic target struck, there was a butcher's bill paid in the bodies of 20-year-old boys who had grown up thinking they were invincible and died learning they were merely human. Matthes had volunteered for a different mission, not Schweinfurt, not on that day. He had been assigned to operations in the Mediterranean theater, where the tactical situation was more fluid and commanders might be more willing to experiment with unorthodox approaches. He had continued to refine his plan, to argue his case, to prepare for the day when someone would finally give him permission to prove that low was survivable, that surprise and speed could compensate for vulnerability, that there was another way to bring American air power to bear against the enemy. The story that would make him famous, the story that would validate everything he had argued for, would come later, in a different theater, under different circumstances than his rigid superiors had ever imagined. But its seeds were planted in these August days, in these arguments, in this fundamental question about the nature of aerial warfare that divided theorists and practitioners alike. Because war is not mathematics, war is not doctrine, war is men making decisions in split seconds with incomplete information and their lives as the stake in every gamble. And sometimes the only way forward is to do what no one expects, to zig when doctrine says zag, to go low when everyone else reaches for altitude. The German crews manning the flak batteries around the industrial targets expected altitude. They had trained for altitude. They had calibrated their guns and ranged their ammunition for altitude. They knew to the degree how much to lead a bomber formation, crossing at 23,000 feet. How to create a box barrage that would force the fortresses to fly through a storm of shrapnel where every piece of metal was a lottery ticket of death. They were good at their jobs, these German gunners, veterans of years of aerial combat, skilled enough that they could look at a formation and calculate its speed and altitude and trajectory without instruments, relying on experience and instinct honed by countless engagements. What they had not prepared for, what their doctrine had not imagined, was an aircraft that would come screaming out of the low haze at treetop level, faster than thought, already on top of them before the first gun could traverse downward to track it. In the months following Schweinfurt, as American air commanders struggled with the brutal arithmetic of loss rates and strategic effectiveness, Matthes' proposals began to receive more serious consideration. Not for the heavy strategic bombing campaign. That doctrine was too deeply entrenched, backed by too much institutional momentum and too many billions of dollars in resources committed to high-altitude operations. But for tactical strikes, for targets where surprise was more valuable than precision, for missions where the objective was not just to destroy but to demoralize, to shock, to demonstrate that nowhere was safe and no defense was perfect. They gave him a chance, not in Europe, where the strategic bombing campaign continued its methodical devastation according to plan, but in the Pacific, where island bases and shipping targets presented different challenges and different opportunities. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber with less payload than the Flying Fortress but far more maneuverability, became his instrument, and a specific type of mission, anti-shipping strikes against Japanese convoys and installations, became his laboratory. The Japanese, like the Germans, had built their defenses with certain assumptions. They knew the Americans had bombers. They knew those bombers would come at altitude, where the physics of ballistics and the limitations of aircraft engines dictated operations would take place. They positioned their anti-aircraft defenses accordingly, ring upon ring of guns calibrated for high-angle fire, tracking, systems designed to follow aircraft at 10,000 feet and above, ammunition stocks selected for maximum effect against targets at those ranges. Matthey studied the intelligence reports on Japanese defensive positions with the same obsessive intensity he had brought to the European theater. He noted the blind spots, the zones where the heavy guns could not depress low enough to track a target, the psychological effect of sudden appearance on gun crews trained to watch the sky rather than the horizon. He calculated approach speeds and bomb release points and escape vectors with meticulous precision, understanding that in low-altitude attack, there was zero margin for error. A single miscalculation, a moment's hesitation, and you would fly directly into your own bomb blast, or give the defenders that extra second they needed to bring their guns to bear. And then, on a morning in late 1943, he put theory into practice. The target was a Japanese supply depot on an occupied island, ringed with anti-aircraft positions, considered by intelligence to be heavily defended and unsuitable for anything but a mass raid by multiple squadrons willing to accept significant losses. Mathis requested permission to take a single squadron, 12 aircraft, and demonstrate his low-altitude approach. His superiors, skeptical but willing to try anything that might reduce the casualty rates that were decimating the bomber groups, authorized the mission with the understanding that it was experimental, that failure would end this particular line of inquiry, and that success would need to be dramatic and undeniable to justify further operations of this type. They took off in the pre-dawn darkness, flying low over the water to avoid radar detection, using the curvature of the Earth itself as concealment. The Mitchell bombers were painted in mottled camouflage, their aluminum skins dull and non-reflective, every detail designed to delay detection for those precious extra seconds that would mean the difference between surprise and slaughter. The pilots flew at wave-top height, their propellers churning just yards above the Pacific swells, their crews silent and tense, watching the horizon for the first glimpse of their target. The Japanese island rose from the sea like a green jewel in the morning light, beautiful and deadly. Through his cockpit windscreen, Matthys could see the supply depot sprawling across the southern shore, warehouses and fuel tanks and ammunition bunkers arranged in orderly rows, and surrounding it all, the black barrels of anti-aircraft guns, dozens of them, manned and ready, pointing upward into the empty sky where they expected the American bombers to appear, as they always had before. Mathis checked his airspeed, 280 miles per hour, right at the edge of the Mitchell's operational envelope at this altitude. He glanced at his altimeter, 150 feet above the waves, low enough that the rooster tail of spray kicked up by. His prop wash was visible in his peripheral vision. He looked at the target and he looked at his squadron strung out behind him in a ragged line, not the tight formation of high-altitude bombing, but a loose tactical spread that would allow each pilot to navigate independently through the defenses and find their own path to survival. And then he spoke into the radio, his voice calm and certain. Commence attack run, stay low, go fast, get out clean. They came in beneath the gun angles, beneath the sight lines, beneath the very psychology of defense. The Japanese gunners, scanning the sky for the high-altitude bombers they had been trained to expect, did not see the American aircraft until they were already overhead, already releasing their ordnance, already banking away in howling turns that pressed the crews into their seats with the force of gravity multiplied by velocity. The first Japanese gun position never fired a shot. The crew was still traversing their weapon downward, still, processing the impossible reality of bombers at tree level, when Mattis's aircraft roared directly overhead and released its payload with devastating precision. The bombs, set with instantaneous fuses for low-altitude delivery, detonated within seconds of release, creating a rolling chain of explosions that marched across the gun emplacement like the footsteps of an angry god. When the smoke cleared, the position was gone, not damaged, not suppressed, gone, obliterated, reduced to a crater and some twisted metal that might once have been a gun barrel but was now just scrap. The second position, alerted by the explosions, managed to get off a burst of fire, tracer rounds arcing wildly across the sky in a desperate attempt to track the American bomber that was already past them, already out of their arc of fire before they could adjust. The third position, the fourth, the fifth, each one tried to engage, and each one fell silent within seconds as the following American bombers walked, their ordnance through the defensive line with the mechanical precision of a harvester moving through wheat. There is a phenomenon in combat that soldiers call the "oh shit" moment. It is the instant when training gives way to panic, when doctrine crumbles before unexpected reality, when the mind simply cannot process what is happening quickly enough to formulate an effective response. The Japanese defenders experienced that moment in its purest form. They had prepared for high-altitude bombing. They had drilled on tracking and leading and creating barrage fires. They had built their positions and stocked their ammunition and positioned their crews according to a well-established doctrine that had proven effective against previous American raids. And now they were being destroyed by aircraft that appeared from nowhere, that came in so fast and so low that by the time a gun crew realized they were under attack, the American bomber was already past them, already dropping its payload, already escaping while the defenders were still trying to traverse their weapons to even acquire the target. By the time Mattis's squadron completed its run, 9 Japanese anti-aircraft positions had been destroyed, not damaged, not temporarily silenced, destroyed, eliminated as functional defensive assets, their crews either dead or scattered, their guns twisted wreckage, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent pillars of black smoke rising into the morning air like funeral pyres for a doctrine that had proven fatally inadequate. The American losses were 0. Not one aircraft damaged, not one crew member wounded, not a single hole punched through aluminum skin by enemy fire. They had swept through the defenses like a scythe through grass, delivered their ordnance with devastating effect, and escaped before the enemy could mount any effective response. When they returned to base, the ground crews gathered around the aircraft in disbelief, examining this unblemished skin, counting the bombs gone from the racks, trying to reconcile the evidence before their eyes with their understanding of what should have happened. Bomber missions were supposed to be costly. You were supposed to come back with holes in your wings and wounded men in your crew compartments and stories of flak so thick you could walk on it. That was the price of strategic bombing, the understood cost of taking the war to the enemy. But here were 12 aircraft, returned intact, mission accomplished, losses nil. The other pilots, the ones who had mocked Mattis's proposals as suicidal, fell silent. Some approached him with grudging respect, asking questions about technique and timing and how he had calculated the approach vectors. Others simply stared, reevaluating everything they thought they knew about aerial warfare in light of this single demonstration that had shattered assumptions and validated a maverick's vision. The mission reports traveled up the chain of command with unusual speed. Commanders who had been skeptical now wanted details, wanted analyses, wanted to know if this success could be replicated or if it was merely a lucky anomaly. Intelligence officers studied the reconnaissance photographs taken after the raid, noting the precision of the destruction, the surgical elimination of specific defensive positions while leaving other structures relatively intact. This was not carpet bombing. This was not the blunt instrument of high-altitude area bombardment. This was something different. A scalpel rather than a hammer, precision achieved through speed and surprise rather than altitude and technology. Within weeks, low-altitude attack tactics were being incorporated into the training programs for medium bomber squadrons throughout the Pacific Theater. Pilots who had flown exclusively at altitude were now drilling on wave-top approaches, learning to navigate by terrain features rather than dead reckoning, understanding that the principles of high-altitude formation flying were often irrelevant or even dangerous at 200 feet, where a single mistake could put you into the ground before you had time to react. The doctrine had not been wrong exactly. High-altitude strategic bombing would continue throughout the war, would eventually reduce German and Japanese industrial capacity to ruins, would prove effective in achieving its stated goals. But doctrine had been incomplete. It had failed to account for situations where different tactics might be not just viable, but superior, where the advantages of surprise and speed could outweigh the perceived safety of altitude, where going low could paradoxically be safer than going high because it placed you where the enemy had not prepared to meet you. Mathis himself flew many more missions, refining his techniques, teaching others, becoming the unofficial prophet of low-altitude attack in a military that had been built around high-altitude theory. He survived the war, though many of his students did not. Low-altitude attack, for all its advantages in surprise and shock, was unforgiving of mistakes. There was no altitude to trade for airspeed if something went wrong. There was no time for a wounded aircraft to limp home. You executed the mission perfectly, or you died, and the margin between those outcomes was measured in seconds and feet rather than minutes and thousands of feet. But for those who mastered it, For those who could combine the precision flying of a fighter pilot with the mission discipline of a bomber crew, low-altitude attack became a devastatingly effective tool. It was used against bridges and rail yards and shipping targets throughout the Pacific and eventually in Europe as well. The famous Dambuster raids by the British Royal Air Force were another manifestation of the same principle: going in low, accepting vulnerability in exchange for surprise, trusting in speed and audacity to carry you through defenses that seemed impenetrable when approached according to conventional doctrine. There was something deeply American about it. This willingness to question doctrine, to experiment, to let results speak louder than theory. The American military, for all its bureaucracy and institutional inertia, had a peculiar openness to innovation born from necessity. The United States had entered the war behind in many ways, its equipment and tactics less refined than those of nations that had been fighting since 1939. But what America had was a culture of practical problem-solving, a willingness to try new approaches when the old ones produced unacceptable results, and an industrial base capable of producing new equipment and implementing new ideas faster than any other nation on Earth. When a tactic worked, it spread. When equipment proved effective, it was mass-produced. When a maverick like Mathis demonstrated a better way to accomplish a mission, the initial mockery and skepticism gave way to adoption and refinement. This was not the rigid military of popular imagination, where generals fought the last war and refused to adapt. This was a learning organization, imperfect and often frustrating to those within it, but ultimately capable of evolution at a pace that left its enemies struggling to adapt. The Germans and Japanese had entered the war with significant advantages in experience and doctrine. Their tactics had been refined in earlier conflicts, Spain and China, and the early campaigns of World War II itself. They knew what worked because they had tested it in blood and fire, but that very experience became a kind of trap. Their doctrine solidified, became orthodoxy, was taught and reinforced until it was difficult to question or modify. When the Americans appeared with different ideas, with approaches that violated the established understanding of how aerial warfare was supposed to work, the Axis powers found themselves struggling to adapt defensive systems that had been built around different assumptions. And so, flak batteries that had been positioned to defend against high-altitude bombers found themselves useless against aircraft coming in at mast height. And fighter tactics that relied on altitude advantage and diving attacks were confounded by bombers that stayed low and fast, using terrain as cover, making themselves difficult to track and dangerous to pursue. And coastal defense guns that could engage targets at 10,000 yards found themselves unable to depress far enough to hit aircraft that appeared over the horizon already inside their minimum effective range. The symbolic power of Mathis's success extended beyond the tactical lessons. It represented something larger about the American approach to war and the American character itself. There was no reverence for tradition simply because it was traditional. There was no assumption that the way things had always been done was necessarily the best way. There was instead a pragmatic, almost ruthless focus on results, a willingness to discard methods that didn't work and embrace methods that did, regardless of how unconventional they might seem. This was the same impulse that had led American industry to abandon traditional manufacturing techniques in favor of mass production and standardization. The same impulse that had led the American military to promote officers based on performance rather than aristocratic birth. The same impulse that made America, in the eyes of both its enemies and allies, a strange and sometimes unsettling force. Powerful but unpredictable, conventional in some ways, and wildly innovative in others, capable of producing both rigid bureaucracy and maverick brilliance sometimes within the same organization. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with low-altitude American bombers spoke of them with a mixture of respect and frustration. They had been trained to fight bomber formations at altitude, where their Zeros could climb to advantage and make slashing attacks from above. But bombers hugging the deck, using every hill and valley as cover, appearing and disappearing in seconds, were a different challenge entirely. To pursue them meant giving up altitude, meant getting down into the turbulent air near the surface where the Zero's advantages and maneuverability were diminished, and the risk of flying into terrain was constant. And even when they did manage to position for an attack, the closing speeds were so high that accurate gunnery was nearly impossible. You had one pass, maybe two, if you were lucky, and then the American bomber was gone, skimming away at full throttle while you climbed back to altitude to search for another target. The German defenders on the Eastern Front and in Italy would have similar experiences as American tactical bombers adopted low-altitude techniques for ground support missions. Panzer crews who had learned to watch the sky for high-altitude bombers found themselves ambushed by aircraft that appeared from behind ridgelines, already in their attack run before the first shot could be fired. Infantry positions that had been sited with fields of fire appropriate for ground combat discovered too late that those same positions were invisible from the air until an attacking aircraft was already overhead, already dropping its ordnance, already banking away. For the American crews who flew these missions, the experience was intense beyond description. High-altitude bombing had its own terrors: the killing cold, the thin air that made every movement exhausting, the long, slow approach to the target while flak burst around you, and you could do nothing but maintain formation and trust that statistics would spare you when they killed the men in the next aircraft over. But low-altitude attack was a different kind of fear. It was visceral, immediate, a constant awareness that the ground was right there, that any mistake would be instantly fatal, that you were flying through a three-dimensional maze of terrain and obstacles and enemy fire at speeds that left no time for correction. But it was also, in a strange way, empowering. You were not a passive participant, maintaining formation while others made the decisions. You were an active agent, using your skill as a pilot to navigate and evade and survive. You could see your target clearly, could watch your bombs hit, could feel the concussion of the explosions as you pulled up and away. There was a directness to it, a clarity of cause and effect, that was absent from high-altitude operations where you released your ordnance into clouds and never knew for certain what you had hit. The veterans of Mathis's squadron, the men who had been there for that first devastating raid, carried themselves differently afterward. They had proven something that needed proving, had demonstrated that courage and innovation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. When they gathered in the officers' club or wrote letters home, they described the mission with a kind of quiet pride. They had been mocked for following a madman's plan. They had been told they were volunteering for suicide. And instead, they had achieved what the official doctrine said was impossible: complete mission success with 0 casualties, accomplished not despite, but because of their unorthodox approach. The legacy of that mission rippled outward through the rest of the war and beyond. Every subsequent low-altitude raid built on the lessons learned that day. Every tactical innovation in ground attack and anti-shipping operations incorporated the principles that Mathis had argued for and proven. The A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells, and later the A-26 Invaders that roamed across occupied Europe and the Pacific Islands at treetop level, destroying transportation networks and supply depots and enemy strong points with devastating precision. All of them owed something to that August morning when one Maverick pilot had finally gotten the chance to prove that the impossible was merely the unattempted. And the deeper lesson, the one that transcended the specific tactics and techniques, was about the nature of innovation itself. Good ideas are not always recognized immediately. Unorthodox approaches are not always welcomed by institutions built around established doctrine. The Maverick is often mocked before they are celebrated, doubted before they are vindicated. But in a conflict where the stakes are survival and defeat is extinction, the organizations that can listen to their Mavericks, that can give their innovators room to experiment and fail and try again, are the ones that ultimately prevail. The American military was not always good at this. It had its share of rigid thinkers and hidebound bureaucrats who preferred the comfort of established procedure to the uncertainty of innovation. But it was good enough, and often enough, that ideas like Mathis's could find purchase, could survive initial skepticism, could eventually prove themselves through results rather than rhetoric. In the end, that may have been the decisive advantage, not the number of aircraft or the size of the bombs or the bravery of the crews, though all those things mattered, but the willingness to question, to experiment, to let a Maverick pilot take 12 bombers and try something that everyone said wouldn't work, the willingness to admit when doctrine was incomplete and tactics needed revision, the willingness to learn from results and scale success faster than the enemy could adapt their defenses. The 9 Japanese positions that went silent that morning represented more than tactical success. They represented the triumph of evidence over assumption, of pragmatism over dogma, of American adaptability over Axis rigidity. They represented the understanding that war is not a science with fixed laws, but an art requiring constant innovation. and they represented in their destruction a small but significant proof of what would become a larger truth about the conflict: that the side which learned faster, adapted quicker, and implemented better would ultimately prevail regardless of initial advantages or disadvantages. Mathis himself would survive the war and return home to an America that barely knew his name. There were no ticker-tape parades for the men who flew medium bombers in the Pacific, no monuments to the pilots who had proven that low could work better than high. The glamour went to the fighter aces and the strategic bomber crews, to the men whose missions fit more neatly into the narrative of how the war was won. But among the community of pilots and planners and tactical theorists, Mathis's reputation was secure. He had been right when the doctrine said he was wrong. He had succeeded when the skeptics predicted failure, and in doing so, he had given future generations of aviators permission to question, to experiment, to trust their own judgment, even when it contradicted the received wisdom. The sun sets over the Pacific now in the same way it did in 1943, painting the water with gold and crimson light. The islands where those battles were fought are mostly peaceful, their scars overgrown with jungle, their gun emplacements rusted and silent. But the lessons remain, carried forward in the training manuals and tactical doctrines of modern air forces, refined and updated but still fundamentally rooted in that basic insight: that sometimes the best path is not the expected path, that sometimes safety lies in danger deliberately chosen and skillfully navigated, that sometimes going low when everyone else goes high is not madness but wisdom. And somewhere in those lessons, in that history, there is a larger truth about human nature and conflict, and the strange alchemy by which free societies at war manage to nurture both conformity and innovation, discipline and creativity, obedience to doctrine and the maverick spirit that questions doctrine when it proves inadequate. It is an uncomfortable tension, one that generates friction and frustration and endless debates about the proper balance between established procedure and experimental initiative. But it is also perhaps the secret weapon that no amount of industrial capacity or technological advancement can replace: the capacity to recognize when the rules need changing and the courage to change them. The mockery had been real. The skepticism had been genuine. The risks had been exactly as terrifying as everyone predicted. But the results spoke for themselves, written in smoke and silence across 9 positions that had been there when the sun rose and were gone before it reached midday. 9 positions that had been manned by men who believed their doctrine would protect them, who had prepared their defenses according to the established understanding of how air attacks would come, and who died learning that the only constant in war is change, and the only certainty is that the enemy who thinks differently will find the gap in your assumptions and exploit it without mercy. That was the lesson written in metal and fire over that nameless Pacific island. That was the truth proven when the impossible became reality and the maverick became prophet. And that, more than any single tactical innovation or technical development, may be the reason why free societies, for all their chaos and contradiction and maddening inefficiency, tend to prevail in existential conflicts against more regimented opponents. Not because they are always right, but because they can admit when they are wrong. Not because they never make mistakes, but because they learn from mistakes faster. Not because they lack doctrine, but because they remember that doctrine serves the mission rather than the mission serving the doctrine. And sometimes, on certain rare mornings when conditions align and courage meets opportunity, that difference means 9 positions going silent when they should have shredded and attacking force and 12 aircraft returning home intact when they should have been burning wreckage, and one maverick pilot finally hearing something other than mockery when he explains why too low was actually exactly right.